Welcome to the Times of Israel's What Matters Now, a weekly podcast diving into one issue that affects Israel and the Jewish world right now. I'm your host, Amanda Borschel-Dan, here with scholar, author, and senior fellow at the Hartman Institute, Yossi Klein Halevi. Yossi, thank you so much for allowing me into your home again.
It's great to have you back.
It is such a pleasure to be here, and to look out upon the Jerusalem forest can never be a disappointment. It's just so beautiful, and you're such a lucky guy to have this as your view as you work.
I really am. Well, you know, the other side of this is that this is also the back of the National Military Cemetery. And sometimes I'm sitting here at work and I'll hear the eulogies from the next hill. And the first time I heard that, I didn't know what it was. And so it just permeates daily life and in the most tangible way. So
it's so true. And Yossi, I don't know if you know this, but that is actually the spot where I decided to make aliyah. I was a very young, very ignorant, naive American, just sightseeing on a Friday. It was my first year here in Israel. And I had this list of spots I was meant to go see, and Mount Herzl was on that list. Not knowing it was a military cemetery, I showed up one Friday morning, and I was, of course, taken aback. And that was the moment that I realized what it meant to be Israeli. And we're living in a time right now, Yossi, and you just
wrote... That's an amazing... Let's sit on that story for a moment. What an amazing story. So was it this sense of all of these young lives that had sacrificed for Israel?
It was definitely that, and understanding what is the decision if I were to really stay here in Israel. Again, I was just a couple months in the country. This is the decision. Am I willing to, quote unquote, sacrifice my husband that I'd never met, hadn't met him yet, my children that I hadn't had? Was I willing to give that up for this Jewish state? And that was the place where I thought, yes.
That's one of the greatest aliyah stories I've ever heard, Amanda. I mean that. And, you know, I've said this to you before. You must write your memoir. And this podcast, unfortunately, is not about your story, but it should be. And this story just confirms that you have an amazing story to write.
Okay, I need to shrink my head a little bit now. And we're here, of course, to speak about a blog, an op-ed, a cri de coeur that you wrote recently and we published on the Times of Israel. What was the impetus for this blog, and what did you try to get across?
So the piece was an attempt to model a moral, anguished conversation about where the war in Gaza is heading. And it was an attempt to really try to ask questions. It wasn't an indictment. And I wrote it for several reasons. One is because I felt that those of us who love Israel, can't leave the moral conversation over this war to those who hate Israel, especially within the Jewish community. If it's only anti-Zionist Jews or Jews who are walking away from Israel that are the custodians of the conscience of the Jewish people, we're really in trouble. And so I felt that need, and especially because I think like many Israelis, I've been hearing more and more unsettling stories coming out from soldiers. And the question that I have is, what will the IDF look like coming out of 2 years of fighting in Gaza? And so it was also written out of a deep sense of concern about the future of our most beloved institution. You know, and this is something it's hard for outsiders to understand. We own the IDF. The army is not some abstract institution. It's obviously not a volunteer army, although in some ways the reservists are volunteers because everyone knows you can get out of reserve duty. And so the army is a combination of a draft and a kind of a volunteer spirit. And there's no distance between us and Sahel, the IDF. And so this deep sense of concern, of anguish that so many of us feel is 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 the army being remade in the image of this government? Or is this going to remain an army that all kinds of Israelis will feel comfortable being in? So that's I'd say the deepest level of concern. And I was also writing this for friends of mine in the diaspora, Jews who have been upholding Israel courageously for the last couple of years, rabbis standing in front of their congregations week after week, sometimes meeting hostility from some congregants. And I'd gotten letters from rabbis over the last weeks saying, what do I say? You know, we've got a lot of sermons to deliver in the next few weeks. And so I felt, as someone who's been writing about Israel for, well, I've lived here since 1982, and I came here writing about Israel, that this is the moment when I really need to, if at all, this is the moment where those of us who are who are part of the public discourse on Israel need to be heard. And the last point here, Amanda, is something personal, which is I made aliyah in the summer of 1982, about 2 weeks before the Sabra and Shatila massacre, just before Rosh Hashanah 1982. And 400,000 Israelis went to protest the massacre and demanded an official Israeli commission of inquiry, even though we hadn't committed the massacre. Our soldiers were on the perimeter outside of the two camps. And as the commission of inquiry later found out, the soldiers did not know what was happening in the camps. Nevertheless, a large part of this population felt the need to hold ourselves accountable for something we hadn't directly done. And as a new immigrant, I felt my place is not yet in the streets. I need to know where I've landed. 2 weeks after coming here, I'm not going out to demonstrate against the Israeli government. I need to listen. I need to learn. I need to put in the time to understand what the arguments are. And fast forward 43 years later, we're now approaching Rosh Hashanah, and I feel that I'm now sufficiently part of this place and this conversation to throw in my 2 cents on this. So
I wrote down several things from your piece. I didn't write down the title. Do you remember the title?
our season of reckoning, Israel's moral crossroads in Gaza. Good title, Miriam.
Yep, Miriam Herschlag, our Ops and Blogs editor. Way to go, Miriam. And it received about 300 comments on the piece itself, not including social media. I'm sure you received many, many, many comments.
More than almost anything that I've written. And it was the hardest piece that I think I've ever had to write.
Right. You told me that the last time I was here, which is one of the reasons why I'm here again, because that for me is intriguing, obviously, because you've written so much over the years. And I just want to understand a little bit more why it was so hard. Every word in here felt that you chose it very carefully with the, what do you call it, with tweezers. You picked out the words. And I just want to read one of the phrases that jumped out at me. There were so many. Even when fighting an existential war against enemies without moral restraint, there are limits to what is morally permitted to the Jewish state. It just flows like poetry in some places. And you can tell that this is a piece that you worked on again and again.
A full month for one article.
Right. So what made it so difficult for you to get onto the black and white?
The second line after that, and I'm paraphrasing, I don't remember it exactly, but it was that, and there are limits to how much self-recrimination and guilt Jews should take on themselves when we're fighting an enemy that seeks to destroy us and that has no moral limits. So you put those two sentences together, and that's my dilemma.
Right. As you wrote, conflicting certainties, and the piece itself feels like it is a struggle. When you're reading it, initially, it's, at least for me as the reader, it felt difficult to understand exactly what is your point of view. You see both sides, and yet. And so, what is the and yet?
That's my point of view, is that I see both sides. And that I was trying to model what I called in the piece two languages on Israel. And that we need to learn to simultaneously speak one language toward our enemies, which is a language of unequivocal contempt without apology. We don't owe our enemies any bearing of our soul, and an internal Jewish language in which we ask ourselves some hard questions. And so, the way that I would give an example for these two languages is to say to those of our critics who are turning us into the world's criminals, I don't recall hearing your voice speak out over 15 years of the Syrian civil war when 1 million Syrians were butchered. I don't recall hearing you protest when literally 80,000 Yemenite children actually did starve to death. You were AWOL. And this is when you show up only about Israel. That's the language that I would say to our enemies. In the internal Jewish language, I would say, really? We're better than Syria and Yemen? Is that what our aspirations were for the Jewish state? I got a note from a friend of mine who is in a Washington think tank and had written an article about proving that Israel had not committed genocide. A very powerful article. And then he said, this article gave me zero satisfaction. Great, the Jewish state is not committing genocide. Now that's an internal Jewish conversation. In the internal Jewish conversation, I don't need to hear why we're not committing genocide. I know we're not. That's not an internal Jewish conversation. And if there are Jews who are saying we're committing genocide, they're not my conversation partners. But when we're having a serious conversation among lovers of Israel, I have questions. I have hard questions. And don't shut me down by saying, yeah, well, Syria and Yemen are worse. Yeah, I know that, and thank you, and that's cold comfort. Save those arguments, for our enemies.
It is such a difficult piece to read and a difficult conversation to have with you as a mother of 3 soldiers, I would say, as well. And all war is despicable, and terrible things are happening throughout every single war throughout history. It's been documented or not documented. I think one of the big differences of today is that it is so documented even by those who are behaving badly. Our IDF soldiers putting graffiti on homes, or, putting on bras from Arab women inside their own homes. This is behaving badly. Even a war crime, one could say, or
I don't think so. Personally, I didn't include those clips in my article deliberately. And an army is not a think tank. An army is the business of the army is to kill people, and many of Israel's critics, I suspect most of our critics, have no idea what an army is actually like. An army is coarse, it's crass. For those of us who had university educations, you leave your university discourse outside the barracks. It doesn't belong in the army. But so I'm not looking at our behavior with a magnifying glass. And I'll give you an example. And I'm sure you remember this. 10 years ago, maybe more. It's like after post October 7th, time has become so kind of relative, and maybe it always is, but it's become elastic. And and there was one of the wars, mini wars with Gaza. An army spokeswoman said, "Our goal is not to topple Hamas. We're mowing the grass. We're going in, we're going to deal with the problem, we'll go out, and we'll probably have to go back in and mow the grass again." And I heard that, and I said, what a relief. We're not, this isn't going to be a total war. We're just going to try to deal with whatever limited problem we have. The way this was heard in the American Jewish community was in exactly the opposite way. What vulgarity. This is how a Jewish army speaks. You're talking about killing people, mowing the grass. I guarantee you that there wasn't an Israeli, no matter what their politics, who heard the mowing the grass and thought there was a problem with it. That's how armies talk. And believe me, that's the best of it.
I think that's how armies talk, and that's how Israelis talk when you have an existential enemy who wants to wipe you off the face of the earth.
Exactly.
On your doorstep.
Exactly.
On your doorstep.
And so this notion that, oh, we're not polite, or there are Israelis who, okay, I wish that he hadn't put the bra on, and it's there's something obviously demeaning and vulgar, and I certainly wish he hadn't posted it. But you send young men into, and again, I understand it's a problem, but still, you send young men into life and death situations relentlessly every day, and they don't know where the next bullet is coming from. Really, that's the problem. We do have problems, but for me, that's not the problem.
Okay, so what are the problems, Yossi? Because as we've established, war is hell and terrible things happen, and the army's job is to kill people. So where is the moral difficulty right now?
So let me try to answer you, Amanda, by if you allow me to kind of reframe the question, which is going back to how do we have a moral conversation? And the prerequisite for a moral conversation for Jews who love Israel is you start by framing it the way you just did. That what we're up against, the nature of the enemy we're fighting, the total absence of any distinction between combatants and civilians, an enemy that hides in hospitals and schools and operates from those places,
and keeps our hostages around them like some kind of bubble wrap,
and on and on. If you intend to have a Jewish moral conversation, and that's not the way you start, and not to start and as just, let's say lidei chova. How would you say that? To
just have the conversation.
No, okay, I'm going to acknowledge that Israel is facing difficulties, but my real point is not that. No, that has to be part of your real point. And that's why when you said that you weren't always sure what my position was, I was really happy, because it's not just a throwaway line to say, to be sure, Israel is facing serious moral, and I hear that from certain anti-Zionist Jewish critics of Israel, and it drives me insane. To be sure, Israel faces faces security problems. Yeah, well, there's no to be sure. We face existential security threats. Now, once we've firmly established what those threats are and the nature of the combat that we're in, now let's look at how are we doing within the constraints of that reality. Now, what separates me from those defenders of Israel who will say that there's nothing to answer for because just look at what we're up against, look at the conditions of battle, full stop. The conversation for me begins there, it doesn't end there. The next step in that conversation is okay, acknowledging, embracing those constraints. Now let's look at ourselves and ask ourselves within those limitations, how are we doing? Could we be doing a bit better? What's going on the ground? Are we losing it? Are we losing the red lines even within those conditions that the IDF would have once insisted on? Is something happening to us on the ground? And so the questions that I raised in my piece, and they were questions, they weren't indictments. My piece was a call for us to begin asking questions, not to bare our souls in front of the world and not to do this atonement, and certainly not to appear before the world as a self-criminalizing nation. We are a wounded nation that experienced the kind of attack that any nation in our place would have responded at least as vociferously as we did. Still, I have questions. Question number one is, how did we allow the situation in Gaza to deteriorate to the point where, after all of the false alarms about starvation, you cry wolf so often, and then the wolf shows up at the doorstep? The wolf apparently showed up at the doorstep, and we didn't notice, or we ignored it. How did we allow that to happen? And that's directed, first of all, against this government, our government, but it's also directed at ourselves, at the Israeli public. I direct it to myself because I didn't write about it for the Times of Israel. I wasn't galvanized. I wasn't asking hard questions. So the belated hard question that I'm asking is, why not? The next question is, every war, regardless of what the army, regardless of the circumstances, let's say almost every war produces war crimes committed by deviant soldiers. We've had our share of deviant soldiers over the year, and that's to be expected. Are more war crimes being committed by individual soldiers in this war than in the past? And are commanders turning a blind eye? My sense from what I'm hearing is possibly yes.
What would you consider a war crime in this rubric?
Shooting civilians without provocation. Now, there is a fine line because, for example, at the food distribution points, when you suddenly have masses of desperate people surging towards you, and Hamas doesn't wear uniforms and could very well be mingling with the crowd, I'm not going to make that call. My question in that case is to the commanders who sent soldiers into that situation without riot gear equipment, without training. How do you do that? And day after day, we had these incidents. And I'm sure that Hamas wildly inflated the numbers of casualties. That goes without saying. But were civilians being killed every day, every other day? Apparently so. And how long did it take us before we started getting the situation under control? So these are some examples of questions, urgent questions, that those of us who love Tzahal, love the IDF, need to ask.
Now, when we talk about your first question in regards to the starvation, where do you see the line is between Israel's responsibility and the responsibility of those who govern Gaza? Meaning,
Hamas?
Yes.
I don't care about Hamas.
Okay.
I don't care about Hamas has no moral responsibility. You only have moral responsibility if you have some basic commitment to a moral life. It's an oxymoron.
So if that's the case, then how can any Israeli soldier be morally correct in firing into the citizens of Gaza, into the residents of Gaza, if all the civilians, those who are not part of Hamas, are completely innocent and there's no kind of connection to any of the leadership, et cetera, et cetera?
Well, we it's very complicated. We can't say that everyone in that crowd was innocent. I mean, again, we don't know how many were actually Hamas, but I think, Amanda, that this is an example again. If I could come back to the two languages on Israel, when we speak to our critics, I would say, "Are you only coming to us?" What and I wouldn't say, why aren't you condemning Hamas? I would say, why aren't you condemning the UN? Because the UN allowed itself to be co-opted by Hamas. And we were trying to correct that. And I think that the impulse for that policy of creating an alternative Israeli mechanism for food distribution was legitimate. But when it became clear that it was disastrously failing, why did we keep going? That's the question that I have. So here again, I would say that there's a question to our critics, which is, don't just come to us, go to the UN. And then there's a question to ourselves.
I think my basic difficulty with your piece is that increasingly I'm viewing the critics from within as dangerous as those from without, meaning
More.
yeah, the internal conversation that we so desperately need to be having. What is internal and what's external?
Great. So let's look at the different kinds of criticism. There's the criticism of those who really care about Israel. And even if some of their criticism is exaggerated, from my point of view, misplaced, I still am engaged with them in a shared Jewish conversation because we have a shared commitment to Israel. I don't have a shared conversation with Jewish anti-Zionists. I don't repudiate them because they're not part of me. They have chosen to be part of the enemy. Now, I don't say that in regard to, every Jewish college kid who decides after taking a course on Middle East studies that, they're anti-Zionist. That's not what I mean. I'm talking about the professional Jewish anti-Zionists, certainly the organized forms of Jewish anti-Zionism. They are beyond the pale. For me, they are Jews for Jesus. And worse, much worse. Jews for Jesus is an annoyance. These people are a threat. So I think we need to make a clear distinction between the different forms of criticism and who the critics are. And the reason that's so important is if we conflate Jews who are opposed to Israel with the criticism of Jews who love Israel, then there's no possibility for an internal conversation. And my Jewish tent is very wide. It includes lots of people on the left that I deeply disagree with. It includes Jewish groups on the left that I deeply disagree with. But I'll give you an example, J Street. I have lots of disagreements with J Street, but they're part of my conversation. And one measure, for me, a personal measure of who belongs to my conversation and who doesn't, is in the American Jewish community, is who showed up in the large American Jewish demonstration in Washington shortly after October 7th. I think it was in November. And it was like 300,000 people there. And there were, obviously, the anti-Zionist Jewish groups weren't there, except for Neturei Karta, which was demonstrating against. But the groups that were there was J Street, there was Truah. Now, I have deep disagreements, profound disagreements with these groups, but they're disagreements. I actually don't have a disagreement with Jewish Voice for Peace because I don't have a shared language. We're not in disagreement. We're at war. That's not a disagreement. I have a deep disagreement with parts of the Jewish left, parts of the diaspora Jewish left, certainly.
But Yossi, don't you think that were there to be such a protest, such a rally today, that these groups would not show up?
Yes, I think that's right, you're right, and I don't know what to do with that.
And that's the element that concerns me the most, actually. Those who initially were on Israel's side after October 7th, seeing the massacre, seeing the really, really horrific things that happened to fellow Jews, that happened on Israeli soil by Hamas terrorists, 1,200 slaughtered, 250 taken hostage to Gaza. These are objective numbers. But as the war has played out, I feel like these people, because they're considered so much a part of the Jewish diaspora, so much part of the Jewish conversation, and since they're so overtly against Israel right now in so much of their rhetoric that you read, this
Yes,
is the most dangerous element.
yeah. Well, look, I have to engage with them. We have to continue to engage with them, because at the moment of truth, they prove that they're part of Am Yisrael emotionally. The Jewish anti-Zionists on October 8th were writing, well, to be sure, this is a tragedy, but let's not forget that the occupation has driven these people to desperation, and it's just like any other tragedy that happened to, let's say, white colonialists who were massacred by their subjects or their slaves, and that's part of what was put out there by Jewish anti-Zionists. With those people, I don't even want to mention their names. Those people are dead to me. The Jews who showed up in Washington, part of my people. The Haredim are part of my people. I want to throttle them sometimes. Uh, the far right are part of my people. What can you do? They're part of my people. Those who on October 8th joined the other side are not part of my people. Jewish Currents magazine, far left anti-Zionist magazine, 4 or 5 of their editors signed a letter after October 7th hailing it as resistance. Now, Jewish Currents, that's about as Jewish as the previous incarnation of the magazine Jewish Currents, which used to be the publication of the Jewish department of the American Communist Party. So no, I have no conversation with you. But I agree with you. I'm anguished about what I hear coming out of the non-insane American Jewish left. I worry that more and more people there are losing it. They're losing their ability to maintain a basic balance. And so that's what we need now, most of all in Jewish life. And on the one hand, if you say there's no problem, we're the most moral army in the world, or you start giving credence to those who say the IDF is a genocidal Nazi army. Well, what kind of conversation can the Jewish people have between those two poles? We're either completely innocent with no need for any moral introspection, or we're Nazis. Neither of those, obviously. I feel closer to those who are desperately holding on to the idea of the IDF as the most moral army in the world. But neither of those positions are useful for a moral Jewish conversation. And if the Jewish people can't have a serious moral conversation, then what are we becoming? What are we going to lose in this war?
The divide between Israel and the diaspora was already a huge gulf prior to October 7th. And I just wonder myself if diaspora Jews can even begin to fathom, even begin to internalize what this October 7th tragedy has done to Israelis and the need or the future of this war. Everyone who is pushing for the war to end now, how do they see this playing out? Meaning Hamas will grow like the grass, the weeds that in prior experiences it has regrown. So what is the idea here? Stop the war, stop everything. Israel is terrible that it continues with this war and Hamas isn't crushed. But at the same time, unless you're actually here, unless you're actually, experiencing the terror of not knowing where your child is when you just heard about a stabbing of Hamas terrorists in the middle of Jerusalem, how can you even fathom the
Yeah,
need to
yeah,
actually finish the job, shall we say?
absolutely, absolutely. And for the first year or more of this war, year and a half, that was pretty much my argument too, that the Jewish state cannot allow the regime that did that to the Jewish people to exist. And failure to destroy Hamas will fatally undermine our military deterrence. I began to look at this differently for a few reasons. One was our extraordinary strategic successes on other fronts, Lebanon and especially Iran, and realizing that we actually had come a long way toward reestablishing the credibility of our deterrence. And without a credible deterrence, we have no future here. And the second reason was the hostages. Now, for the first year of the war, I did not participate in the hostage demonstrations. I felt it was undermining us. And in retrospect, I realized that I had prioritized defeating Hamas over saving the hostages. And that was the government's position. And I implicitly supported that. It was hard to make that acknowledgement explicit, to say, oh, so you're ready to God forbid sacrifice the hostages. So I couldn't quite admit that, but in practice that's what I was doing. And I think much of the Israeli public did that. We began to see a shift in the Israeli public after the 6 hostages were murdered by Hamas. There was another incident where 2 hostages were accidentally killed by soldiers, and the shift began. And for me, I wrote about this in the Times of Israel, that I I realized that I had now shifted my priorities, and we see close to 70% of the Israeli public has made a similar shift, and from prioritizing defeating Hamas to saving the hostages. And for me, the main reason was actually strategic, because I began to feel that if, God forbid, the government allows the hostages to die when we could have possibly saved them, the consequences on the Israeli psyche will be devastating. A very large part of this country will conclude this is not the same Israel that I once believed in. And this is an Israel that is no longer committed to basic Jewish values, Pidyon Shvuyim, redeeming the hostages. This is an Israel that has lost the IDF ethos that we leave no one on the battlefield. And whether that's right or wrong, I'm not arguing that for the moment. The fact that so many Israelis feel this deeply could have strategic consequences. It could impact on the motivation of young Israelis, many young Israelis, to serve in the future. So that's one of the things that worries me. And that my main concern right now, post October 7th, is the healing of Israeli society. I feel that we have damaged Gaza as much as is useful at this point, and maybe more. maybe more than that. And what exactly are we leaving Hamas to govern? How is Hamas going to emerge from the ruins and govern? Now, there's another element here, which is our government, the same government that's saying we have to continue fighting Hamas because we can't leave them in power, is refusing to come up with a political alternative to Hamas that the Arab world wants to buy into. And so, what's the alternative? Are we going to have to continue fighting this war until we've killed every last Hamas terrorist? What's the moment where we can proclaim victory? This is to say nothing of the impact we talked about, relations with the diaspora, what this war, continuing this war, will do to the liberal Jewish diaspora, which is 70% of American Jewry, for starters. What this war is doing to our place in the international community. We've never been in a war situation like this, including in the aftermath of the Yom Kippur War. I think that in many ways this is much worse. And it's just going to the hole we're digging is getting deeper and deeper. So even if we win this war, technically, and again, I don't even know what winning means anymore, we're going to lose. And the final point here is that what began on October 7th is not the Israeli-Hamas war. That was a sideshow. The war is the Iranian-Israeli war. All of these other we're fighting a seven-front war. Those are all proxies. It's Iran. And this war is going to be determined not in Gaza, but in Iran. And the war isn't over. And meanwhile, every day that we continue in Gaza City, we're losing more and more of our moral credibility. I spoke before about our need for strategic credibility, for deterrence, the credibility of our deterrence. There's also something that's essential to our security, which is our moral credibility. And if we lose our moral credibility, that means we lose our friends. It means we lose a large part of the diaspora. And that will have serious security consequences.
I agree with you on a holistic level that the actual greater war is against Iran. But don't you think that were we to pull out now from Gaza, that basically we're condemning that front to be a forever war?
It depends how we do it. Not if we have a political plan, which is to bring in the Palestinian Authority. And the Palestinian Authority is everything that the Israeli right says it is. It's corrupt. It has never truly recognized our right to exist. It has supported terrorism. They're hypocrites. But we need a fig leaf to bring in the Saudis and the Egyptians and the rest of the Arab world into Gaza. And the fig leaf is the PA. And we know, look, the PA is not a partner for a peace agreement. That's where the Israeli left got it wrong. But the PA is a partner for temporary arrangements with Israel. And we know that on the ground in the West Bank. We have security arrangements with the PA that work every day. And so let's have arrangements with the PA in Gaza. And in that way, bring in the Arab world. Is there a risk? Yes, there's a risk. I'm concerned about, which is the same thing Netanyahu is concerned about, which is bringing more pressure for creating a Palestinian state, if you bring the PA into Gaza. And I think he's right about that. I don't think we have an alternative at this point. And, we do have an alternative, but it is going to drag us down. And all of the gains of this war on those other fronts, God forbid, will be lost in the hell of Gaza City.
Okay, what I'm going to say sounds incredibly paranoid, but we're friends, right? And it's just the two of us here. All right. So what do you say to those who may propose, for example, that bringing the PA in and then having the Arab countries help rehabilitate Gaza is just another step towards the eradication of Israel, meaning you build up this slice of land that is ruled currently by those who are so intent on completely obliterating Jews in Israel, that they are giving up their own residents, their own brothers to do this. And then you rebuild it and you have the same people inside that strip that is just a fraction of a hair away from Israeli citizens. And then eventually, piece by piece by piece by piece, Israel is no longer.
There was a map that was on posters all over Israel when I made Aliyah in 1982. I came the summer of '82, and the withdrawal from Sinai had been in I believe it was April '82, a few months before I came, and there were still the remnants of the campaign to stop the withdrawal. And the most powerful image of the campaign was this map that showed the Sinai and the state of Israel. And the map was segmented. And you saw like the stages of dividing and cutting up the land. Begins in Sinai, cutting, 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 until the entire map is just a collection of disembodied territory. And that map made such an impression on me that here I am all these years later speaking about it. It was so vivid to me. So I take that seriously. I take that it's not paranoia. I take that concern very seriously. But the problem for Israel is that there are no good solutions. Not in Gaza, not in Judea and Samaria, the West Bank. Our reality is not composed of choices between good and bad. It's bad and worse, for the most part. No, that's for whatever reason. If one wants to think about this spiritually, we could, that's it's a very interesting and I think actually important question why Israel is in the situation it's in. But looking at it from a political point of view, the fact that the arguments on the right deeply resonate for me is not the home run that the right thinks it is, because they're not addressing the arguments that the other side is so preoccupied with. And that's why I'm a centrist and not a leftist, because the left makes the same mistake as the right. The left doesn't seriously address the concerns of the right. The center is that battleground, that meeting point between the insights of the left and the right. And that's the place that I try to write from. And that's the place that I struggle with. And it's not an easy place because you don't always come up with the answers that are credible. Because, and I hear this from my friends on the left and the right, choose. So I do choose. Eventually I do choose. But my process is to go through looking at where each side has a point. And there are no shortcuts in dealing with our excruciating dilemmas, whether they're immediate in terms of this war or whether they're endemic to our situation. And those who always have the answer, no matter what, they always know exactly what to do. If you're on the left, well, obviously, we need to trade land for peace. And on the right, well, there's no such thing as peace. And so I'm listening, and this has been true for me from the day I landed in this country and started listening. Said, oh yeah, right, those guys have a point. Well, what's going to be with the Jewish and democratic state if we absorb millions of Palestinians? And then, well, wow, those guys have a point. We're facing a Palestinian national movement that doesn't accept our legitimacy. What other country in the world faces that kind of political dilemma? And then you say, okay, now what do I do? So the answer of the left and the right is to shut out all the inconvenient truths of the other side because your insight is so overwhelmingly true for you, and it is. The only problem is that for the other side also has a really powerful argument. And so what do we do? at the very least, and this is a good time of year to be thinking about this. We're supposed to be struggling. We're supposed to be a people of struggle. You know, at Yaakov Avinu, the patriarch Jacob, received the name Israel from the angel because he struggled with the angel through the night. So we received the name Israel through struggle. And what drives me mad about our ideologues on the left and the right is, where's the struggle, guys? You know, this is the Jewish people. We don't get an easy pass. There are no quick solutions here. And so I'm stuck in the middle, wrestling with our angels and our demons. And I think many, many of us in Israel and the diaspora are in that place.
Yossi, I've taken up way too much of your time, and so I really appreciate
It was great talking with you.
Not arguing, not talking, struggling. Yeah? Yeah.
Thanks, Amanda.
Thank you. Thanks for listening to The Times of Israel's What Matters Now. Please check out another installment next week. This episode was produced by the Podwaves. If you have any questions or comments about this or any other episode, please drop us an email to podcast@timesofisrael.com. Until next week, shalom.